Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co., and here are 5 first impressions reviews for you. Yes, if you've watched videos in this series, I actually have a jingle that technically goes along with, but I'm not totally happy with that jingle, so I might try to workshop it again. For right now, forget the jingle. We have 5 games to give you my first impressions on. As usual, these are first impressions reviews. In most cases, I think the Key I've played more than once. The rest of these I've only played one time, although I have played a lot of regular Legendary, and I have played a whole lot of Pandemic systems, so I do have like a decent amount of backstory to all. Backstory is the wrong terminology. A decent amount of what's the right word? A decent amount of experience with these games to some extent. Nonetheless, though, these are first impressions reviews. I do not feel I've played them enough to call this a full review, and so instead we have 5 first impressions review in a single video for you. Let's go ahead and dive into these in no particular order. Let's go ahead and start off with Legendary What If. This is a new standalone game in the, well, new is relative, it's like a year old by now, but it's a relatively new, is it a year old or less than a year old? I think Gen Con was it? Was it Gen Con? It's not super new, not super old. It is a new version in the Legendary system. This is What If, and it has all these new characters, or more specifically, new versions of characters. You want to play as Captain Carter, as Captain America? Yes, they're here in this game. But it also introduces some changes to Legendary, and this is tricky because do I tell you about Legendary? Do I tell you about this? Let's tell you briefly about Legendary. Legendary is a deck building system, a cooperative deck building system, although there is a kind of, it's not really fully cooperative. In fact, the fully cooperative is a bit of a problem. It's more like, you know, you're trying to collectively destroy the various things that show up, but there is one player who wins more than the others. There's also a solo mode, but ultimately you're dealing with these various characters as you recruit their cards into your deck, and then deal with the villain and their mastermind and their schemes and their twists and all those things as you deal with all the villains that are showing up in the timeline that have to be dealt with. But ultimately, it is a deck building game. Try to assemble the best deck as the various hero cards show up in the row. What If introduces new characters. It also introduces some small changes to gameplay. The main one would be the changes to the solo mode, so if you do like playing this solo, there are some specific changes around that, but past that, it is mostly just Legendary. For context, I played through this and then had to reread the changes to try to see if there's anything meaningful. It didn't feel meaningfully different. Like, there's more cards for higher player counts. Again, there's things that are there as far as changes, but as somebody who has played Legendary, it just kind of felt like Legendary outside the solo mode changes, which are a drop more noticeable. So that's kind of what this is. Ultimately, it doesn't really change my mind on the Legendary system. I always find that specifically for some reason, with Legendary, I always find I'm trying to play it as a cooperative experience, even though it is not technically a cooperative experience and doesn't really work that way as well. It works as a game where you're out for yourself, but I have a hard time really getting into that with the theme of the game. I don't know why, I don't know what it is about it. I guess maybe because we both have Captain Carter in our deck, it just feels like we should be on the same team, but we're not. Whatever reason, this has never really worked fully for me. It's a very popular system. I enjoy parts of it, but I've never fallen fully in love with it. It's a 3.5 out of 5. Asterisk that on most of these, I would say, well, this one I'll give an exception. Well, okay. When I give a first impression rating, keep in mind it's based on the limited exposure to that game, so take it with a bit more of a grain of salt than you would with a typical rating. I will say with the Key and with Legendary, I have enough experience with those systems that maybe those ratings should get a bit more credence, but like these 3, even though I've played Pandemic, this is a different version of it, so just take those things into account as we go through this. From there, let's go ahead and dive into the Key. We mentioned the Key. The Key is actually probably my favorite game on this list, but it also does get a ding. Specifically, this version of the game gets a ding. The basic premise of the Key is you're trying to solve a case. You are all working independently to solve and figure out exactly what happened. In this particular version of the Key, there's several versions in this game series, this particular version is Escape from Strongwall Prison, and it has the various prisoners all escaped, and you need to figure out which laundry cart they hid in, which final destination they went to, and how they got out of prison itself, as well as the various members of their crew. This is actually one of the twists of this game, is that you have to kind of figure out what happened, but then you also have to figure out who was in their crew in order to get that final clue result. But as far as what you're doing over here, you're going to flood the table with tons and tons of cards that you can just flip over at your leisure, making sure to tie the right cards to the right case color that you're playing as. There's a bunch of keys. I think there's 9 keys, 9 colors, and you have one particular color you're playing with, so if you're playing with the red case, only flip over cards that have red on it. It's all very obvious when you actually play the game. But all these cards have various pieces of information for you, so you have things like, I don't know, the person who was the leader of this gang member escaped through the small hole. The person who took this route to this laundry did not escape through the largest hole. You're kind of being given this small piece of information that on its own mean nothing, or very, very, very little. But as you accumulate pieces of information, they all come together. If I know that gang leader A didn't escape through the smallest hole, and gang leader B didn't escape through the largest hole, that only eliminates one hole from each of the two things, but nonetheless, it is slowly giving me information. So as you piece together it all, you kind of come up with what happened, and then you enter your clue and see if you are the one who did it, and as well counting up how many pieces of information you needed. So there's a small element of speed, but it's more about how little piece of information you can actually work within the system to figure it out. One of the problems with the system is inherently you could be given duplicate information. Duplicate doesn't mean a straight duplicate, the game doesn't have that, but I might be given a piece of information that tells me a specific thing that another piece of information happens to give me the exact kind of end result. Even though they're different starting points, because of the clues they have, sometimes you just get hit with excess information. So now you're being dinged 4 points for a card that didn't even help you. That's a small complaint, because ultimately I play the key to figure out what happened, not because I actually care who won the game. We're both kind of figuring it out on our own, and then we're like, who did it better than the other player? I like the key system. I find it's a fun little game that has a degree of competition, but it lowers the stakes. There's not a lot of reason to care who actually won, past like, I did it better. Ultimately, you're trying to solve this little deduction game. It plays well solo, it plays well with other players. I do have a specific complaint around Escape from Strongwall Prison, in that multiple times playing through this particular version of the game, I got things wrong, and I still don't understand how, unless something about the rules is not clear. Now, this is a problem here, because this is a logic game, so ultimately you're like, well, Alex, you're just wrong. Your logical putting together is wrong. But in some cases, every piece of logic I have fits perfectly with one end result. I've backtracked it multiple times, and I don't know what's going wrong unless something about the rules isn't clear. This has not happened always, but it happened at least twice in the game where I'm like, no, 1 + 1 = 2, 2 × 2 = 4. I know the process of operations, I know all of this stuff, I know everything. What is happening that's going wrong over here? And I can't figure out whether I'm misunderstanding the rules. I feel I must misunderstand the rules, or whether maybe I'm just logically deducing the wrong thing. And there's specific aspects. The reason I bring up the rules is there are specific things within the rules where I'm 95% sure that I'm doing it right, but I'm not 100% sure I'm doing it right. Like, specifically with the directions, you'd have to play the game to know more what I'm talking about. Specifically with the directions, as you try to go ahead and figure out how the laundry vehicle got to its final destination as it smuggled the boss out. Specifically there's elements where I'm like, I think this is what it means, but maybe this is where my logic puzzle falls apart. But I'm not really sure what to do about that. So I'm going to give it a small ding on that. Ultimately, I usually rate the key as a 4 out of 5. I'm going to give this one a 3.5 out of 5, but even that I'm not certain about. I would say take my overall 4 as a general recommendation for the key system. Something about this one, there's some rules uncertainty combined with some false end results that have me a drop frustrated with this particular version compared to other versions in the key system. That's going to be a 3.5 out of 5. From there, let's go to Scrap Racer. Let's kind of clean out this side before we move to anything else. Scrap Racer is from Queen Games and is a very light push-your-luck racing game. Ultimately in the game, you're going to have a character with their asymmetric abilities. You're going to roll dice, but you roll them one at a time, and as soon as you hit doubles, you can't keep going. So maybe you roll a 4. Boom, keep going. What's the chance that you roll a 4? You roll a 6. Ooh, that's 10 spots. Because a 4 and a 6 is 10. You'll move 10 along the racetrack. But if you roll a 4 or a 6 again, you bust, and you have to take a crash card. And so basically it's a push-your-luck game where the more dice you roll, you need unique numbers to not crash. But as you get duplicates, you will eventually crash. Eventually you have enough crashes, there is a bonus factor to that. So there's some compensating factor to crashing too many times. And then there's abilities that'll happen when you cross the finish line. There's 3 laps to the race. And you have a slightly variable racetrack, which only matters in terms of how it impacts a few abilities. It doesn't have a huge difference in the game. But ultimately, this is a pretty straightforward push-your-luck racing game as far as trying to complete 3 races, utilizing abilities, and just pushing your luck better than the other players. That's the core idea of what it's doing here. There's nothing wrong with what Scrap Racer is doing. It is a fun, fast, easy push-your-luck game. The rules overhead is very low. The gameplay is very straightforward. There's enough abilities to keep things a little bit on the interesting side, but ultimately it's also very much on the lighter side. I have to imagine the target audience for this is gateway gamers or family gamers, and I don't know if there's anything particularly new and interesting for the system. For me, it kind of reminds me of Crazy Races, was that what it's called? There was a never really strongly available in English game, but I have a German copy of the game with German printouts of the abilities. But there's a game called, I think it's called Crazy Races or Crazy Racers, that also has a push-your-luck system that I thought was more engaging overall, but they're kind of just doing a very similar thing. I think it's fun, it's a good game, it's a 3 out of 5, doesn't do anything particularly innovative, but sure, if you like push your luck and racing, it definitely delivers on those fronts. Then from there, we have, let's go with Footprints, and we'll save Star Wars The Clone Wars for last. Footprints, coming to you from Chili Fox Games, who I generally, what do they have that I like? They did Spectacular, right? I love Spectacular, oh my gosh. Footprints is a game that I think could benefit from a drastic rehaul to the visual aspect of this game. This game is not a bad game. It's a pretty decent game as far as building, it's not the highest recommendation. Board Game Co., it's not a bad game. No, it's a pretty good game as far as once you get to the mechanics of the game. It's all about building up a tableau and trying to expand your tableau. It kind of reminds me of a bit of the Quest for El Dorado, that deck building game, but you have these terrain tiles. You're gonna have these terrain tiles over here that you're trying to move along to get to the end. It's not really about getting to the end, but getting to the end will give you points, where it's different from Quest for El Dorado in that sense. It's just, you get to the end, you get more points. Getting to the end faster helps you there. Ultimately, it's about trying to get as many points on your journey as possible, and you're going to do that by playing your tribe cards, trying to build these, I can't remember if they're called artifacts or relics here, or engravings. There's something, I can't remember the name of it. You're trying to create these things. You have to accumulate resources, then create those things, put them on the board, get benefits from where they're next to. The specific spots where you can place your main relic will also give you points based on how well you did certain things. But ultimately, the main game is about playing a card, and then that's going to increase how good you are at traveling over certain terrain types, and the juggling of which terrain types you move over is part of the game engine. In fact, actually, speaking of Queen Games, it reminds me a bit of Kathmandu as well. Very similar arc as far as the juggling of the movement and how you get from the beginning to the end, and the juggling of different things along the way. So altogether, it's a satisfying experience of placing cards, building a tableau, getting stronger, optimizing your movement, and trying to find ways to score as many points as possible along this journey better than the other players. Visually, the game is dry as anything. The rulebook is just walls of text. The game itself doesn't pull me in from the visual stuff at all. The cards don't look engaging. Everything about this game just screams dry to me. Now, thematically, it's cavemen, so maybe that works thematically, but nonetheless, there's a reason. Like, this is one of the, I got this at Gen Con 2023, if I'm not mistaken, and it's taken me over a year to table. I think there's like 2 games from Gen Con 2023 I hadn't reviewed, and like, I got a lot of games, I came back with a lot of games to review. There were only 2 left outstanding. This is one of those 2 that are left outstanding, and it's because I never really had the interest in pulling off the shelf, and even after playing it, I'm still left with a, hey, it's a good game, but like, it's not a great game. If it was a great game, looks wouldn't be enough. It's a good game, I enjoy it, but ultimately the looks definitely hold it back. If I'm rating it from the gameplay alone, it's a 3.5 out of 5. If I'm rating the full package, it's a 3 out of 5. And I do rate by full package because ultimately, how a game looks is a factor in my desire to pull it off the shelf and table it. Mediocre games have risen because of great graphic design and production, and great games have fallen because of bad graphic design and production. Although I will say, I don't think it's bad graphic design. I think it's very much a matter of taste, and my taste is not there for this one. Coming up next, we have Star Wars The Clone Wars, a game in the pandemic ecosystem that takes advantage of, the pandemic system, where things that got hit harder, which granted, if you don't know the pandemic system, is probably not that helpful to you. This is a cooperative game taking place in the Clone Wars universe, I guess. You're going to be playing as various Jedi, you'll have a specific villain in each game, and then you have the missions you're trying to accomplish, different number depending on the skill level, and your goal is to accomplish the missions and then take on the villain in their final confrontation, meanwhile managing the fact that every single round, more droids are populating on the various planets, and the villain is trying to get in your way, each one operating with a different flavor of what they're trying to do. Overall, the game, and it uses the Pandemic system in terms of how the game cooperatively tries to do the bad things. So if you've played Pandemic, it will feel very familiar, but there are a lot of differences to it as well. You're going to have squad cards that are going to be your health, but also you can use them, and you can use them again and again, and that's going to help you accomplish missions, as well as do everything else in the game. That's a nice little flavor thematic change that I appreciate about the game. Your character abilities are lots of fun. The villains are pretty strong and hard to deal with. A lot of good overall things going on here in Star Wars The Clone Wars. For me, it fell flat. And it's not because it's a bad game. It's a good game. But for me, because of the fact that this is built on the pandemic system, and because of the fact that that system doesn't feel as thematically involved with this one, like the whole nature of the pandemic system, the way it operates, is it operates with a very thematic aspect of the things that got hit get hit again. This is very thematic to a pandemic. If you have an outbreak in Toronto, you're likely to have an outbreak later in Toronto. You can't, it's hard to fully exterminate the disease. And granted, you can make that same argument about the enemies you're fighting. Like, if they were on Kashyyyk, maybe they'll come back to Kashyyyk, you never fully got rid of them. I don't really find that thematic interplay works as well. And trying to spread across the entire galaxy doesn't feel I don't have a great way of explaining why this one doesn't land as well for me. I really like the squad cards. That's a fun thing where you add squad cards and they help you every single turn. The villains are fun. They're nice and dangerous. They are hard to deal with. But overall, I can't say I fell in love with the system, and I do think there's probably a degree of me comparing it to Pandemic and just wanting to play that system in a Pandemic game as opposed to in a Star Wars The Clone Wars game. So it might just be that aspect that's holding me back for this one. Ultimately, I'm going to give it a 3.5 out of 5. I still had fun with it, but I find myself just wanting to play Pandemic instead. Anyways, those are 5 first impression reviews for you. We have Legendary What If coming in at a 3.5. We have Star Wars The Clone Wars coming in at a 3.5. We have Footprints coming in at a 3 out of 5 with that asterisk on why that rating. We have The Key coming in at a 3.5, also an asterisk. That should arguably be a 4. Specific issues with this one. And then we have Scrap Racer coming in at a 3 out of 5. In any case, until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you found this helpful, and as always, I hope you have a good one.